All right, so again, welcome everybody to OSI's Planning Lunches at Noon, or Plan Monthly Webinar Series. Be sure to check out OSI's Planning and Zoning Training website page at the link shown on the screen. Before we get started, we're just going to go over a couple logistics. This webinar will consist of a roundtable discussion followed by a question and answer session. Attendees that are online can submit their questions at any time in the chat box or can raise their hand during the question and answer session and ask their question verbally. Both of these features can be accessed as shown at the bottom of this slide. Attendees participating only by phone will have an opportunity to ask their questions verbally as well as during the Q&A session. If you haven't done so already, as I've mentioned, please turn off your microphone and camera. And as shown below, your microphone and camera should have a slash through them, as we'll be recording this webinar, and any cameras that are left on may become part of the recording. So welcome to the March webinar in the Planning Lunches at Noon webinar series, Regional Housing Initiatives Roundtable. I'm Noah Hodgetts, an assistant planner with the New Hampshire Office of Strategic Initiatives. I'm joined by Todd Horner, planner at the Southwest Region Planning Commission, Kayla Tavares, Community and Economic Development Planner at the North Country Council, James Vayo, Project Manager at the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission, and Alex Belenz, Planner at the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission. So here's a brief agenda for this webinar. Before we begin the roundtable segment of the webinar, each of our four speakers is first going to provide a brief summary about the housing initiative that they were involved with, which include the Manchester Housing Task Force, Keys to the Valley, the Monadnock Housing Roundtable, and facilitating housing outreach and discussion with North Country businesses. So I'm now going to turn it over to James Vayo from the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission to talk briefly about the Manchester Housing Task Force. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to be able to talk about the Housing Task Force and how that came to be. So the Mayor's Housing Task Force was incorporated into the Mayor's State of the City address in March of 2020, and over the year of 2020 established the Housing Task Force made up of stakeholders from throughout the region, affordable housing developers, market rate housing developers, city staff, and tenant groups. And of note of that was a group called Manchester Housing Alliance, which made a concerted effort to reach out to the mayor's office with a communication requesting this task force be assembled. And so the task force quickly got to work identifying the challenges and the barriers to affordable housing and the general development of housing in the market, and trying to identify ways to mitigate the impacts of those barriers or alleviate those barriers. And so that's the kind of the gist of the task force. The task force met probably 3 or 4 times throughout 2020 into the fall, and the city is actually in the process now of taking the recommendations of the task force in their subcommittees and drafting them into a report that will be published by the mayor's office. And that report will include concrete actions to change city policy and zoning regulations to make it easier to develop housing within the city. I don't know. I think that's about it for a description on that.
Okay, next, thank you very much, James. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Alex Belenz from the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission to talk about the Keys to the Valley initiative.
Thanks, Noah. Can you hear me all right?
We can indeed, Alex. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me here. Similarly, excited to participate in this discussion. So our Key City of Valley initiative is something we've been working on for about 3 years. It is a bi-state initiative covering the greater Upper Valley region that we took on with our 2 neighboring regional planning commissions in Vermont. And this bi-state approach has allowed us to dig into some of the complexities of the broader regional housing market, which has been a big challenge for this region. It's a housing market that is pretty challenging to understand for everyone here, including policymakers and developers. We have the largest single site employer in New Hampshire, Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, as well as some other significant employment centers. We have some major tourism destinations like Woodstock, Vermont, and Killington Resort. We have 2 interstates that converge in White River Junction that enable some swift commuting patterns around the region. And we have a mix of communities. We have some larger urban centers like Lebanon, Claremont, and Springfield, Vermont. We have some kind of traditional New England Village and Main Street communities, and some very rural areas. And with all that split up across 2 states and many communities with a variety of regulations and policies, it's really challenging to understand the overall regional housing market in various submarkets, and therefore is challenging to understand what the true housing needs of the region are. So that's why we've taken this collaborative bi-state approach. At the same time, while our scope does cover this large region of 67 towns, we are definitely taking this on with an understanding that individual homes are a deeply personal issue, that safe and secure homes are a matter of individual and public health, and that having a safe and secure home is often one of the most important steps in assisting those who are in need and struggling in our communities. So that's why, in addition to doing a lot of kind of regional research and data collection, we're taking a deep dive into public engagement for this initiative, including conducting focus groups, doing surveys, and collecting personal stories of people's homes and their experiences. So to highlight some of our key goals, it is a pretty broad-ranging initiative, but a couple of the key goals include, as alluded to before, really demystifying the housing needs of this overall region. We need to better understand and demonstrate demand, particularly for more affordable homes on both sides of the river, and be able to effectively communicate those with who are working in the housing policy and development world. We also want to set up communities and partners for success and define what success might look like for them. So part of that is just demonstrating how other communities and regions have created needed homes in ways that strengthen their communities and tax bases. Part of that is highlighting the available regulatory and planning tools and how they can be used to advance or hinder these goals. And part of it is going to be encouraging those in that world to think outside the box a little bit. So to highlight some of our key findings and deliverables, currently about 1/3 of residents in this region are cost burdened, meaning that they're paying over 30% of their household income towards housing costs. This includes almost half of renters. And so this translates into a pretty high demand for more affordable homes across the region, and that's projected to increase over the next 10 years. We are really keying into the needs of providers of homes with supportive services. This includes home services for mental health, disability, substance use, and other needs. It's a very effective model for supporting residents in needs, but there are some barriers out there for creating more of these homes and providing more of these services that we're trying to address. We also want to show what adding new homes can look like in our region, particularly within existing communities and neighborhoods. So I've created some visualizations like the one that's shown on the slide to show this. So this is an image of Windsor, Vermont that shows how 13 homes could be added within a single block that's existing in a way that is consistent with the character of the overall neighborhood. So in rural and small towns, looking at opportunities for this kind of infill development that's consistent with neighborhood character can pretty meaningfully address some of the housing supply challenges. And this includes thinking about ways to enable things like duplexes or small multi-unit structures that can contain a few homes for people. And lastly, we're looking at, how can we plan for smart development that strengthens communities through the process of creating or adding new homes? So we're preparing an entire online toolbox consisting of different strategies, regulatory approaches, and planning tools that local and state officials, staff, developers, and partners can use. And we're also trying to highlight how with good planning, we can move past some of the common hangups and concerns that come with new housing development, like school taxes, and show how adding new homes can actually strengthen local tax bases when we consider things like taxable value per acre, connections to existing infrastructure, transportation systems, and other things of that nature. So we're planning to launch a website this spring that includes all of these tools and the findings from our studies. And then we'll be bringing that information to our communities and to the residents of the region. And so we're hoping to launch that website next month, and we'll be carrying it forward from there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Todd Horner to describe the Monadnock Housing Roundtable. Todd, the floor is yours.
Great. Can I get a mic check, Noah? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you were good. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for allowing me to share with you a little bit about the Monadnock Housing Roundtable. We're a bit earlier on in our process than in the Upper Valley, so it's really great and instructive to hear what other regions are doing on the issue of housing. But here in the Monadnock region, housing has been a common issue and challenge that a lot of our constituents have identified, and its connection with a number of different planning issues has come up again and again. Workforce development, we've heard housing as being a key constraint on businesses' ability to recruit and retain workers. We have also been looking at our region's changing demographics, how the 65 plus population is expected to double by 2040, and the 85 plus population is expected to triple over the same time period. And what does that mean for housing production and available inventory moving forward? Energy, it connects with energy and sustainability. So housing is connected with a lot of different elements of our work program. So the Housing Roundtable started meeting about a year ago, and it was simply intended initially to be a space to discuss these challenges and others with a variety of stakeholders. We got started, we were planning our first meeting right as COVID became real, and we were hoping to host a series of meetings in person, with the idea being that this would be a opportunity for coalition building and networking. And we were having serious doubts about whether the timing was right to move forward, considering we were forced into a virtual environment. But we pulled our stakeholders, and the interest was keen enough that we decided to move forward. And so we've been meeting virtually on a periodic basis over the last year. And really, up to this point, the meetings of the roundtable have acted as a forum for sharing educational resources and really getting our feet wet as a region to dig into some of the housing challenges that we're grappling with. So initially, we just looked at what other regions are doing, how have other regions organized on the issue of housing and workforce housing, inviting staff from, for example, the Greater Seacoast Workforce Housing Coalition to hear a little bit about how they structure their work and organization. Most recently, we had a meeting focused on state legislation. This legislative session, there have been a lot of housing-related bills, and understanding how that legislation could impact housing policy and production in local communities is an important part of understanding how the housing landscape is changing or could change. And that was an area a focus area that participants in the roundtable have identified as an area of interest. And moving forward, like I said, we're about a year into our meetings, but we've been meeting on a periodic basis in a virtual format. So looking forward, we'll be focusing on, how do we sustain this work over the longer term? What does that mean for how we structure and organize the group? And what are some of the action items that we really want to focus our attention on? One of the challenges of a multi-stakeholder group like this one is that we have folks coming from the supportive housing arena, developers, real estate professionals, social service agencies, staff, municipal officials, local advocates. So, finding common interests and areas where, priorities overlap is going to be an area that we're focusing on in the future. So we're in the beginning stages still at this point, but looking forward to further organization and coordination with the Roundtable. So I'll leave it at that, Noah.
Great. Thank you very much, Todd. Finally, I'm going to turn it over to Kayla Tavares, who's going to describe facilitating housing outreach and discussion with North Country businesses.
Great, thanks, Noah. I'm going to do a mic check too. Everyone hearing me okay?
Hi, we can hear you great, thank you.
Perfect, thanks. So I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about how we have been facilitating our housing outreach and discussions with our businesses in the North Country region. And I guess I'll start by saying this is something that is more of a philosophy for us than it is an individual project. So it's something we have worked to incorporate into our economic development planning and into a really exciting project we've been working on since last summer with the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority to really study the North Country's housing needs. And so for us, this is something that we try to incorporate into all of the different aspects of work we do as a regional planning commission. And so in the last year or so, I'm going to point out that the picture I have added to our wonderful slideshow today is a Zoom meeting, because we too, like the Monadnock Housing Roundtable, have kicked off a lot of this engagement and discussion with our business community in this virtual environment. And we too sort of questioned how productive and successful it would be. So far, we found it to be working quite well, and we've been coming together pretty regularly to talk with our constituents a bit about what it looks like. And frankly, we've found Zoom to be quite helpful because our region is so large, we're getting a larger audience together. So we have been really focused on helping understand for ourselves how businesses are impacted, so the overall health of businesses, and then their employees specifically, but then also helping open the eyes of our business community to some of the different ways housing might be infecting them that they may not always see very clearly. And so we've engaged with our business community directly, from small businesses like bakeries that employ 2 or 3 to some of our ski areas, larger retail centers, and manufacturers who employ considerably more. We've also found great partners with our local economic development corporations and some industry groups who are learning in our region are also honing in themselves on the way housing impacts their businesses, particularly with work with Ski New Hampshire and our tourism businesses and a local organization called White Mountain Attractions that sort of work together in those industries. And from that side, we've been hearing a lot about how they already understand these issues to be impacting them. So our goals in this work are sort of twofold, right? One is to help the business community open their eyes, as I said, and see the ways that they may be able to invest and to really understand how some of their impact with recruiting and retaining workforce may trace back to housing, whether or not that is exactly how they hear it, how it relates to commute times and other topics. But then to also see and hear from the business community what housing investment would look like from them and where their concerns are with it, so that we can see the places where we may need to hold up some other sort of regional programs or incentives to create a space where some of these businesses can centralize some investment and see that they can make investments in housing without feeling like they're entirely entering a new market. So we are underway in this project as well. And I'll say that this spring, we will be working on standing up some really interesting case study work we've been doing through economic development planning that looks at resort towns out west and different areas of the country where they have already sort of tackled this challenge to see where we can find some good lessons learned and good opportunities to try and mimic or understand what it would look like for our businesses here to model that. And then through our great work with New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, we're working to come up with case studies overall about how we improve and address our housing challenges up north, trying to stand up some tools and strategies there. So we are mid-process in some of our specific deliverables and projects here, but very much so over the last year, we've realized that it's more of a philosophy than a project for us to continually try and open the eyes of our partners to housing.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kayla. Thank you to all of our 4 panelists today. We're now gonna I'm gonna lead a roundtable discussion with our 4 speakers focused on some of the innovative solutions that they've actually already started discussing that have come out of these 4 regional housing initiatives. And unfortunately, due to the constraints of Microsoft Teams, I'm not able to spotlight our 4 speakers on the screen. But so in lieu of that, I've asked each of them to introduce themselves when answering a question. So panelists, I guess I'll just ask you all to unmute your lines. And the first topic we are going to discuss is the role regional planning commissions play with regional housing, specifically the requirement that RPCs update their regional housing needs assessments every 5 years. So Alex, this one's for you. How do you incorporate the housing needs assessment requirements set out in RSA 3647 into the Keys to the Valley Regional Housing Study?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so we made it a point to include the key data points related to the traditional regional housing needs assessment in this initiative, and those will be available on the website we're creating. So we'll have information on there about cost burden, age, types of homes, projected demand for housing units, that sort of thing. So municipalities will be able to reference that data when they are updating their master plans, or if they're going to be doing a fair share housing analysis with their planning or zoning board. So we wanted to make sure we were kind of satisfying the typical data requirements that come with that housing needs assessment. But we also felt it was important to that data be presented in a context beyond our regional planning commission boundary, so that planning boards and others working on housing issues in their communities will also be able to consider the housing needs of the greater Upper Valley region across both states, and how those needs may be felt in their individual communities. And then with the online toolbox of different housing strategies, they can take a look at, what does the data say, and what are some strategies that might be appropriate for us to adopt in our community to tackle some of the housing needs that are being faced. So we wanted to address, the kind of core data requirements of that assessment, but also present a broader context as well.
Perfect. It sounds like a lot of you guys are doing a lot up there in the Upper Valley. Thank you, Alex. The next topic we're going to tackle is how collaboration worked in these different initiatives. This question is open to any of you, James, Todd, Alex, or Kayla. Whoever wants to chime in first, go ahead.
Yeah, this is James Veo. I would just note that at least in the instance of the Manchester Housing Task Force, that the collaboration of stakeholders that participated in that task force was essential to developing consensus objectives, and consensus recommendations. You know, we had at the same table, but outside their typical roles, you know, the director of community development, local real estate and rental property developers, affordable housing advocacy groups, all sort of vying for their own priorities within this complex issue of developing housing. And so in the end, it required a lot of deliberation and vetting before anything could be accepted as sort of meeting the litmus test of all the constituents that were part of the process. And so I would say that part of collaboration was essential in developing the final recommendations, which will be published by the city soon.
Great, thank you, James.
No,
Todd,
I can. Yeah, can I jump in? This is Todd Horner.
yeah, please go ahead. Thank you, Todd.
I'll just know in terms of collaboration, what I'm finding more and more is that periodic group meetings isn't going to be enough to really change the landscape here in the Monadnock region. They're important forums, the meetings of the Roundtable, for gathering folks that are coming at this issue from very different angles and identifying potential for collaboration. But I'm also finding that complementing that group discussion with one-on-one outreach, I think is going to be really important. You know, one group that has been not as well represented at Roundtable meetings are employers. And from my perspective, employers are a big piece of the equation here. Workforce housing, or the lack thereof, is a serious constraint on their ability to recruit and retain members of the workforce. And it's one thing for a planner like myself to communicate that with our various stakeholders. It's another thing for example, one of the largest employers in the region to say, this is impacting our ability to do operations, to operate as a business, to expand, to be able to bid on contracts. The lack of housing is really challenging us on that front. That's a powerful message, and that's you know, a powerful person to be delivering that message. So, you know, I think bringing employers into the fold through one-on-one outreach is a place that we'll be focusing on moving forward.
Great, thank you, Todd.
Noah, if I can, this is Kayla. I want to add to a bit of what Todd's saying, because I'm finding myself nodding my head over here a bit. And so one of the things I wanted to sort of mention is that we're really realizing that it's very much about having the time to have those conversations with the employer to help them just express what they're seeing as their impacts. I mean, in the same sort of vein, as a planner, I understand the way housing may impact an employer, but asking them the question so that they see the way it's impacting them themselves has been a really helpful way for us to help them think about what it is to invest in some of those solutions. And we have really honed in on sort of where do we go with the private sector from here? Because as we all know, they move quicker than the public sector does oftentimes towards solutions. And so we've tried to find ourselves keeping pace a little more with them to ask questions explicitly around why they would or wouldn't invest in housing, so that we can understand how to create a space where they're more likely to say yes.
Great. I look forward to hearing more about that later in our conversation, Kayla. Alex, did you want to add anything else on collaboration and consensus building before we move on?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, some great suggestions and insights so far. I think one thing we're trying to think about is how can we promote a proactive approach to the creation of new homes and communities, as opposed to kind of the reactive approach where a lot of residents end up getting involved. And so we've laid out some strategies that we'll be including in that online toolkit. Things like, you know, neighborhood level visioning work, where residents are working with planning board members or staff, seeing if there can be opportunities to work proactively with folks who want to build or create new homes in a community before specific plans are proposed. Things like creation of local housing committees that have been shown to be pretty successful. There's a great example in Norwich, Vermont, where they're making some good progress on finding locations for affordable housing. So we want to, empower communities to, have, set them up for success when dealing with something like consensus building. And I think a lot of that comes back to trying to take as proactive of an approach as we can. But I do want to also, reiterate what Todd was getting at, is that, this is important work, but it's not easy. And we don't want to obscure the fact that this will require things like one-on-one outreach and some significant investment in time. I don't want to make it seem like, if you just kind of get the right process down on paper, things will go a lot more smoothly. It's going to come down to kind of local champions with support from people like town staff and regional planning commissions kind of doing the legwork to get it done.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Alex. Well, I know a few of you have touched on the kind of need to involve businesses and colleges and other large employers like hospitals that may not traditionally be in the business of developing housing. How are you, as part of these initiatives, any of you, kind of trying to convince these businesses and other large employers that it's in their interest to invest in new housing for their employees?
Yeah, so this is James Veo, and I just want to give an example of something that may still have value to any of the communities across the state, and that's the employer-assisted housing. And this is something that the New Hampshire Realtors Association was big on a couple of years ago, as well as the Boston Federal Reserve. And so a few years back, when I was working in the city of Nashua, we actually held a pretty major event where we invited large employers within the city's downtown to come and learn about employer-assisted housing and try to solicit their interest in partnerships with affordable housing developers in the city to bring around incentives for ownership and for relocation for employees to live close to where they work, to help mitigate some of the congestion issues and to revitalize the downtown. And so that's one I would point at. And then another one that is pretty interesting that Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission did some years back, and Jay might have even been here when this happened, is a Ready, Set, Go program, which was pre-certifying commercial sites for development. And so what it was doing is allowing developers to come in, to talk to the planning board or the zoning board about concept plans and master plans prior to putting together a complete package, which can be very costly to hire an engineer to do all the site civil work, stamped plans and all that, which are typically required for a planning board. And so this certified site program really allowed for a dialogue with planning boards to help them understand the concept, help bridge divides and viewpoints and positions so that more projects could get done. And I could see a program like this easily being adapted to allow pre-approved parcels within anywhere in the state for housing development and very specific concepts of housing development.
Great. Thank you, James. Anybody else, Todd, Alex, or Kayla, want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, this is Alex. I can share what we've looked at, a few keys to the Valley. And one of the things we did is in one of our research tasks was trying to look at, what are some of the organizational and financial models for kind of creating needed new homes that other regions or states have implemented. And part of why we looked at that was, we have organizations locally like Twin Pines Housing who are doing really great work in building what we'd call traditional affordable units using things like tax credits. And And our challenge is that the affordability challenge in our region is greatly exceeding the organizational capacity for that type of affordable housing development. And so we wanted to look at, what are some of the other models for getting investment. And one of the more encouraging models we found was the concept of a regional equity fund. They operate much like a traditional lender, but are more mission focused on things like affordability, and can offer things like lower interest rates and longer loan periods, which makes a big difference in terms of the ability of a developer to offer rents or prices at more affordable costs. And so there is a group in the Upper Valley region that is interested in exploring this model further. There's a coalition of some organizations and large employers who are getting involved in that. And one of the benefits of that approach is that it allows an employer to invest in creating needed homes for their employees and for the broader region. They can see a financial return directly on that investment, but they also then don't have to serve as the developer of the homes themselves. So it can address some of the capacity issues that might come along with smaller or more mid-sized employers who might shy away from being the one who actually kind of serves as the developer of homes for their employees. So that's a model we're excited about, and it's something that's being kind of actively studied now in the Upper Valley. So we're excited to see where that goes.
Great, thank you. All right, well, I think in the interest of time, we're going to keep moving on to our next topic, which is we're going to discuss the role that the private sector is playing, and it's kind of a continuation of the previous question. The role that the private sector is playing in the housing conversations with a focus on the North Country. So Kayla, this one's for you. And I know you've kind of already started to touch on this, but what, if any, opportunities and innovative solutions has the business community identified which could lead to additional housing investment in the North Country?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I have to probably start by giving a disclaimer, which is we're still so in process with this that I truly think we are likely 2 or 3 months out from feeling like we have those tangible strategies that are accepted, or at least we have enough interest in to see really move in the region. But I'll take a few minutes to tell you guys about what we are hearing in sort of some of the directions people are already investing. And some of it builds on what Alex was mentioning about how you sort of get the smaller and mid-sized businesses to find a way to sort of pool their resources to invest. In our conversations, we've come across more and more business owners who have already invested in housing. And that has been a really eye-opening experience for us as a regional planning commission. When we get on the phone with things like a small bakery in Conway or a restaurant in Lincoln Woodstock area, we've actually heard that some of them have already purchased those homes, be they a multi-unit building down the way or a single family home they're housing some employees in. But we realized some of them have already struggled with this and decided they needed to make a move on their own. So we've been really asking the question of how to get more people to do that by understanding what those challenges are for them. We have in that very much seen that while some businesses are willing to make that individualized investment, it's a scary notion to them. And I'm going to steal a little quote someone mentioned from one of our business discussions, but one of our businesses said, "We already have a day job." And that was a really, really just good way for me to understand the way they look at it from their point of view. They're busy as it is running the business that they've built and continue to operate and are, hopefully, I imagine, intending to grow in the region. And for them to take on housing management, particularly for employers who'd see not just 1 or 2 employees looking for a place they could assist with, but have a real critical mass of employees that need assistance with housing. They're concerned about what it is to add property manager to their list of skills and services they provide. And sometimes it seems very different from the work they already do. So while we found some who are willing to make those small investments, we've really heard from many that, like Alex was saying, a way for them to come together and have another entity who is more aware of the housing landscapes and management of housing properties, but that they can look to invest in and support has been a piece they have self-identified as something that would make it easier for them to understand what it is to invest in housing.
Great. Awesome. And then kind of on a related note to the need for kind of businesses, employers working with other, workforce housing providers that are already in this space, have you heard from these businesses yet about any kind of additional incentives, either at the municipal or state level, that they believe is necessary to spur additional housing development?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a quick list for you. One is assistance with permitting. A lot of our businesses are small, and if they're looking to add residential onto their existing property, that's an alarming thing to figure out. They're not sure how it'll be received in their community, and some assistance understanding what that permitting process looks like and navigating it is something they have recommended. They've also looked at better allowances for mixed use and accessory residential units. Some of our communities do a great job in that. One example is Conway. The town of Conway allows all commercial developments to have an accessory residential unit similar to an accessory dwelling unit at a single family home. But so how do we get more ability for people to sort of co-locate residences with their businesses? And then also an idea that has come along the way is we do need to have some places where the leniency of the rules are relaxed a little bit, or where we provide some other structure or program that allows businesses to get a bit of a return for investing in that housing. So we've been talking with some of our communities about the way TIF districts and other things may potentially be down the road tools that could be tweaked to help provide some incentives for that investment.
Great. Sounds like a lot of great ideas to explore further. I know that there's a couple bills still alive in the legislature this session to address some of these, including a bill that would expand 79E, Community Revitalization Tax Credit, for use outside of downtowns for creating something called housing opportunity zones. I believe I have that correct. And that bill is still alive. I believe that's House Bill 154, if I have the number right. And that is still moving forward. I think we'll probably have a vote in the House in the next few weeks. So we're going to turn to our next topic now, which is exploring some of the housing issues which both urban and rural communities are struggling with throughout the state. So this question is for James, Kayla, or Alex. What similarities do you see in the impediments to developing more housing in your community, whether it's urban or rural areas?
Yeah, and just a quick note, this is James Vale. In terms of the supply-demand curve that we, all sat through in economics class, it seems as though with COVID that we're both having a supply and a demand issue, and that seems to be, the supply end of it seems to be there's challenges with local land use boards, there's challenges with zoning regulations and permitting, but there's also challenges with construction costs and skilled labor availability. And then you pile on top of that the fact that people are leaving places like the Boston metro market and buying, single family homes in rural parts of the state and here in Manchester too. And so you kind of get this double whammy that's hard to mitigate all at once. So just a thought.
No, we hear that over and over again, James, but I don't think it hurts to reiterate one more time of this inequity between supply and demand, in addition to the pressure from the greater Boston market, is just kind of really exacerbating our situation here in the Granite State.
This is Kayla. I'll add to that from the sort of North Country perspective, where we're very, very much rural. I can't agree more with the things James is saying as impacts. We feel those certainly too, and I agree. I think they're felt across the state, regardless of the type of community you're in. But another piece we've realized is that up here, a lot of our smaller towns don't have very experienced planning boards when it comes to housing policy, and helping them understand how to review project developments and how to work towards a yes on those has been a struggle point, because they find themselves sort of poorly tooled to address some NIMBYism and neighborhood opposition they might run into. So our sort of skill and knowledge of our planning boards up north has been something that can add additional challenges for us.
Great. Thank you, Kayla.
Yeah, this is Alex. I'll jump in. I think one shared challenge that we're seeing is particularly in recent years and decades, a lack of what we call missing middle housing that's being built. So this includes things like duplexes and other small multi-unit structures. And these, they can look just like a single family home. They fit in well with the character of existing neighborhoods. And they really can take a bite out of some of the housing shortage challenges that both rural and more urban or more well-developed communities face. And a lot of those barriers that we see are shared. Some of it is on the regulatory side. There are sometimes restricted or disincentivized through zoning, whether that's intentional or unintentional. And there's also some fixed building costs that, they don't necessarily scale down with the size of the development. So, things like putting in a septic system or hooking into the sewer system, that kind of thing, that, it can be a little bit harder to realize a return on investment for those. But they're a really good and important part of healthy and vibrant neighborhoods. And so what we're trying to look at is, what can communities do to reduce some of those barriers, particularly through the permitting process, to allow some more of those types of structures to be built.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Alex. I'll just add to kind of tie that into a question we got a little earlier in the chat from Keith about asking for commenting on progress of rules and regulations concerning small housing units, specifically ADUs. This ties right into the point Alex was just making. There was a bill in the legislature this session, House Bill 189, which would have required communities to allow up to 3 ADUs as of right on any single dwelling unit lot. That bill was voted inexpedient to legislate, so that won't be moving forward this session. However, I do want to give a plug to the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. Is currently working with the Congress for New Urbanism, CNU, on a project on code reform, with specifically with putting together kind of draft regulations and model ordinances, specifically to how to target it at this idea of how do you incentivize and make it easier to permit smaller units, ADUs, other smaller missing middle housing geared towards this very issue that that Alex is discussing. And that, my understanding is that project is still in the pretty early process, but should be, so stay tuned for that. More information on that coming out later this year and early next year. So we've gotten to our last topic. We are probably going to run a little over since it's now 12:52. So we will, don't worry, I will leave some time for questions at the end. So our last topic is discussion of the role land use boards, which must approve of their community's master plans, from which zoning ordinances are supposed to be derived, play with housing. And this topic and questions are really focused on the Manchester Housing Task Force. So James, can you provide some examples of how the Manchester Housing Task Force recommended revising Manchester zoning ordinances to better reflect the master plan's vision?
Yeah. So I'm going to give specific examples from the zoning subcommittee I took part in as part of this housing task force. And one of the other colleagues that participated in this process was Max Latona and Jason Torrens from the Center for Ethics and Business and Government from St. A's. And they actually have, they have a lot of good relationships with academics and professionals in the industry around housing. And so they were able to collaborate with a couple and bring forth some recommendations which were incorporated into our subcommittee. And so, on a high level, the way those recommendations were structured, and that made them pretty amenable to the overall group, was that they took an incremental approach to increasing density, residential density specifically, and they did that by by looking at the holistically the way zoning was structured and addressing each individual area of zoning. And so I'm going to run through a couple of these things. I'm not going to read them verbatim, but I'll just note where things of significance came out of the woodwork from this process. And so the big one at the top of the list was allowing residential uses in the general business district. So as it stands in Manchester, residential uses are not an as-of-right use. So you couldn't just go down to City Hall and pull a permit for an empty lot downtown if you were going to build any kind of housing on it. It would have to be industrial or retail or some kind of commercial use. So this was a pretty big deal, and the way this is envisioned is really to be pretty small units, maybe 1,200 square foot lot sizes, which may be unfathomable for some parts of the state, but for here, there's plenty of examples of product like that already exists in Manchester. The second recommendation was around allowing by right duplexes and multifamily buildings in the central business district. So this again kind of falls under this allow residential in your downtown, which as of right now is not a by right use in downtown. You have to go and request permission to build residential within the downtown. And from there, it spreads out into the lower and lower density areas of the city. So it's what they call R1, R2, which is a two-family, and then R1A and suburban, and it goes on. And basically, what the recommendations included were reverting back to lot sizes that reflected the lot sizes that already existed in the city. And so this is not unique to Manchester. I think I saw this in my time in Nashua as well, is that planning and zoning over time, maybe periods of low demand and people, sort of white flight from the cities, saw a need to mitigate the loss of property in their city centers. And so they ended up increasing the lot sizes, increasing frontages in traditional neighborhoods that had already very much smaller lot sizes, much smaller frontages, higher densities. And so there's places like the Tree Streets in Nashua and on the west side in Manchester where if a building burned down today, you couldn't build that same building because it wouldn't meet the zoning the same way it was built 100 years ago. And so a lot of the recommendations looked at incrementally bringing the density in the lots configuration and geometry back to what used to exist in the neighborhood some time ago. And so that was a big one. And then finally, because I'm paraphrasing all this, the last two big ones are reducing parking minimums. Right now, I think, we have like a 1.5 space per unit in Manchester, and the recommendation is bring it down to 1 space per unit. and expand ADU ordinance to eliminate conditional use permit, basically making it an as of right use, and to ease some of the restrictions around the floor to area ratio, parking associated with bedroom counts, things of that nature.
Great. Well, thank you. So that's going to conclude the roundtable portion of our discussion. Here are a few links to additional information about these 4 different regional housing initiatives, including the first bullet is an article in the March/April edition of Hampshire Municipal Association's Town and City magazine, titled Regional Planning and Coordination Are Critical to Addressing New Hampshire's Housing Crisis, which summarize what we've just heard from the speakers in writing. So that's another great resource, as well as different websites and recordings of meetings from each of these initiatives below. And I did send out a PDF version of the slides this morning, which should include live hyperlinks for each of these links. And if anybody's having any trouble accessing those, feel free to just shoot me an email and I'll figure out what the issue is. And then here's all of our contact information. Just a reminder, as I said, that I sent out the slides this morning, and the recording this webinar, as well as a link to a brief anonymous feedback survey form, will be available on the OSI Planning and Zoning Training website page, as shown at the link here on the right side of the screen. Recording should be up by the end of the day tomorrow. And recordings of previous OSI Plan webinars are also available on this page, including recordings about some of OSI's housing-related resources, such as results from the Municipal Land Use Regulation Survey, as well as OSI's Annual Housing Trends Report. And both of those webinars include accompanying interactive map tutorials, which are also available on the website. So with that, I'm sorry, we're running behind time a little bit. I'm going to begin the Q&A session. If you're online, feel free to type your question in the chat box at the bottom. If your chat box isn't open, you can click the little chat icon to open the box, and you can type your question in. And then we'll also go ahead and unmute the phone lines. And if people also have questions they would rather speak rather than put in a chat box, you can use the raise hand function here, and we'll go ahead and call on you to ask your question of the speakers.
Noah, this is Todd. Do you mind if I kick things off with a question? I actually had a question for my fellow panelists to maybe just get things started here.
Yep, please.
Yeah, so one thing I've been thinking about over the course of this conversation is related to missing middle development that Alex mentioned, and accessory dwelling units. And we've talked a bit about how local land use regulations, permitting and approvals can inhibit, that type of development. I'm wondering if regulatory reform is a necessary but not necessarily sufficient step in order to, promote this type of development. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm wondering, is there a pent-up demand among homeowners and property owners to develop this type of housing, or do we need to be more proactive in cultivating local developers, essentially, to take advantage of any sort of regulatory reform that might take place in the upcoming years? I know, New Hampshire Housing has some guidance documents on ADUs, but I'm wondering if some more, proactive work in this area would be needed to really make a dent in our housing needs through missing middle and accessory dwelling units. And maybe it's not an answer we have right now, but I just would be curious to hear if others have thought about this and whether it's something we might want to look into in our respective regions.
Sure. So unfortunately, James had to leave for another obligation, but Alex or Kayla, do you want to chime in on that question from Todd?
Yeah, I can share a few thoughts. This is Alex. So I think that's like the perfect question to be asking about this. And I think there is, some stuff on the regulatory side that needs to be looked at. But I think there's also concerns, from homeowners about, is this something I'm capable of doing? Do the finances make sense? How do I go about doing it? And that's some things that we've explored through our study are things like creating publicly accessible plans for ADUs that have kind of been vetted and proven to be, good quality and desirable plans. And then seeing if there are opportunities for programmatic support for things like ADU construction. There's a really interesting pilot program in Montpelier, Vermont, through the, I forget which, I think the Vermont State Housing Authority, where they're providing some assistance with things like pre-construction design, securing financing, permitting. Like they're basically doing this pilot where they're helping folks get through that process with the grants of up to $20,000 for folks who qualify. So that's a really encouraging program, and we're taking a look at that. So I think it's a mix of both of those things, but there is certainly a kind of an educational part, and then there's maybe even some more that kind of the public sector, the nonprofit sector can do to, get some folks over the hump in crossing some of those barriers.
I'd agree with my other panelists on this. I think it is the perfect question to ask, one I've been asking myself too. And I agree with what Alex is sort of describing. I do think that we sometimes as planners, we can make the assumption that people explore our rule books and see what they may mean for themselves and can make those steps to actual action. And I do think that it takes advocates and it takes some local champions, and the idea of having pre-designed plans for things like ADU and those sort of incremental development increases is something that can go a very long way to let development of new housing that is very easy to integrate into existing community character easier to do, and the same with missing middle. So we've seen some communities in our region that have changed the rules, and they say we feel as though we're in a position where we've built it in the regulations to be allowable, but it hasn't come yet. And so I do think you need to go a step further to communicate that out to the development community, be it formal developers or just homeowners who are considering what to do with the backyard.
I think that point is really, really well taken. Is how do you get non-traditional developers who may not be familiar with regulations? How do you get them to come to the table? That discussion has been really, really, really helpful. Let's see. I know there was, I believe I answered a question earlier in the chat about Keith's question about commenting on progress of rules and regulations concerning small housing units. Susan Slack had asked about how the regional planning commissions are funding their work on housing. Todd, Alex, and Kayla all responded in the chat to that about using a combination of New Hampshire housing mini grants, being able to include housing-related activities and economic development funding proposals, including funding from the Federal Economic Development Administration, as well as from some public health funders. So I'm not going to rehash that right now, go into more detail. Let's see what else we got here. There was a question from Michael about tiny housing and multiple accessory dwelling units. I think we have touched on this a bit. Does anybody have any other thoughts about the role that tiny housing and multiple accessory dwelling units plays that we haven't already? We did just kind of talk about this in depth about how do you get the non-traditional developers to the table. Anybody else have anything to add on this one?
Yeah, this is Alex. I can throw out, one thing we haven't talked a lot about today that becomes a factor for some of the smaller and mid-sized towns is, what areas are served by local water and sewer. So that is for things like, infill ADUs, being able to hook into the sewer as opposed to having to expand, a septic field or something like that is greatly helpful. So with a community, they can, one thing to look at would be in areas that are served by water and sewer, what could be done from a regulatory standpoint to kind of enable or permit or incentivize those types of units. From the tiny home side, we've heard a lot about how there are very specific kind of code related considerations for tiny homes and how that is a fairly involved process going through with groups like code enforcement and fire and others to figure out a way that those can be permitted in a way that is safe and kind of works with regulatory goals locally. Those are a couple things that we've looked at through our study.
Great. And I will just add on the tiny house front, there was another bill in the legislature to kind of, there was one bill which then got amended, but final form would have just kind of clarified some of the definitions of what is a tiny house and such. Unfortunately, that bill was recommended in expedient legislation, so that is not moving forward, but obviously the theme of tiny houses keeps coming up, so I'm sure we're likely to see another bill on this topic next year as well. I have a question from Michael. Says, ever consider an ombudsperson? This information needs to be pushed out to the communities in need. Yeah, Michael, I think that's a really great point. I don't know if any of our speakers want to comment on that, but I do think it is kind of a chicken and the egg situation often, where the communities that need this information the most don't have it. And those that do have this information maybe are already doing it, and so the need is not as great there. And so there's often this kind of disconnect. I don't know if any of our speakers have any thoughts on that.
This is Alex. I'll just throw out that is, through our study, we are looking also at recommendations that we can make to our elected statewide officials on the Vermont and New Hampshire side of the river. And one of the things that we've looked at is the idea of creating kind of a statewide housing ombudsperson. And this is a model that's actually been used in the United Kingdom, and it's another level of advocacy for folks like tenants to be able to better understand, what their rights are as a tenant, and to provide support for landlords in things like code compliance and fair housing and that sort of thing. So that's included in our recommendations that we'll be sharing with state legislators.
Great, thank you, Alex. Question from Andrew Bodnerick. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Where does fair share fit into all of this? Where do master plans fit into all of this?
So, no, this is Todd Horner. I'm assuming Andrew is referencing the state's workforce housing law. And, you know, I think I'd be curious to hear what my fellow RPC staff have to say on this. But, you know, my personal understanding of the workforce housing law is that it's subject to a fair degree of interpretation. There aren't, I think each region and each community has taken a different approach to what exactly is meant by fair share. I know New Hampshire Municipal Association has provided some guidance on this topic in the past, but I think the best approach to answering that question would be to consult with the RPC in your region for more tailored guidance on that question. And in regards to master plans, I mean, I think master plans are a great tool for setting the stage for regulatory reform. I mean, it's really the process that local communities can use to, you know, pull the residents on where do we want to go as a community, and to really take a multidimensional look on what it means to have a lack of housing options in a community, and to get a better handle on, you know, where do we want to be in terms of increased housing production, and what are some specific strategies to get there. So I think master plans are a great opportunity to have those conversations and to act as a precursor for, you know, real zoning and other local regulatory reform.
Great. Thank you, Todd. And I will just add on this one, I am a co-lead of the Planning and Regulation Working Group of the Governor's Housing Council on Housing Stability right now. And one of the areas we are exploring is creating a standardized template for future Regional Planning Commission housing needs assessments, which may include at some point trying to later on develop a standardized methodology for calculating fair share. Up till this time, the New Hampshire Supreme Court and the New Hampshire legislature have declined to create a standardized fair share methodology. But I do think a lot of people, me being one of them, would think that, you know, having a standardized methodology that all communities are kind of looking at this issue would be valuable. So hopefully we may have more on that to report on later in the year. So stay tuned on that one. I do want to be cognizant of time. We'll take one or two more questions, and then we're gonna wrap it up. Keith asked, where does the resident go for help on understanding some of the restrictions on secondary ADUs, where it involves simply converting an already existing structure instead of building another structure? George Regan from New Hampshire Housing responded. He put a link in the chat box about a guide that New Hampshire Housing developed about with helpful tips and templates for homeowner, and kind of a guide to the process for homeowners looking to develop ADUs. So hopefully that's helpful. Michael Thornton is asking for, or saying that there's a need for a good, succinct, successful boilerplate for ADUs and tiny houses, which would satisfy state regulations. As ZBA member, they're getting more requests recently for ADUs and tiny houses. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about kind of if that's going to be rolled into any of your initiatives. Are you guys thinking about doing anything about like that, Alex, as part of the toolbox you're creating for Keys to the Valley?
I'd have to circle back and look to see specifically what we're including in there. But I think that's part of what we want to look at least, you know, promoting the general idea of having things like publicly available plans. You know, a municipality could take a step of kind of, you know, pre-permitting certain plans, which has been done in other parts of the country for ADUs. That could not only help the landowner go through the process easier, but makes it the review process by the ZBA be much more straightforward, so that it's a standardized process each time that one of these comes forward, or not each time, but more of the time. So something we are taking a look at.
Great, thank you. Another question here from Mary Ellen McKay. Has the discussion happened around special exceptions rule number 7, which states ADUs and principal dwelling units must be connected by an interior door? ADUs used to be used as rental units, would be in conflict with this. Renters have an exception of privacy in their homes. ADUs were developed initially for families of individuals with disabilities and needed this interior connection. How does this get rectified? Would this need legislative clarification before a zoning board could approve this ADU as a rental? Any of our speakers care to comment on this one? This gets into a bit more technical, and if not, this may be a question, Mary Ellen, that you can, if you follow up with me via email with your question, I'm happy to forward your question. I think it's a good one to one of my other colleagues.
This is Alex. I think I maybe am misunderstanding the question potentially, but one of the differences in the Upper Valleys on the Vermont side of the river, ADUs that are detached from the home are permitted by right in state law, as are attached ADUs, while in New Hampshire, it's only the attached ADUs are permitted by right. And so that's something that we plan to bring up with our elected officials to see if and talk with communities about if there's a need to kind of get on the same page as Vermont with that, or if we kind of like the statute where it's at. But it sounds like there's some more specific clarifications, even if it doesn't change the nature of the law, that could be beneficial as well.
So, and George Regan from New Hampshire Housing has responded that the interior door requirement is written into the attached ADU law and would need to be amended to be removed, and that's state statute. I'm just having a couple of other questions which don't really look like comments, or a couple other comments which don't really look like questions for the for our speakers. And so as we are 20 past the hour, I'm gonna wrap it up at that. So thank you everybody for attending today's webinar. Next month's plan webinar, Welcome to the Board and Introduction to Land Use Boards, will take place on April 15th from 12 to 1 p.m. This session will be led by my colleagues, Stephanie Verdial and Michael Klass, principal planners at OSI, and is designed for brand new planning, zoning, and other land use board members, and is designed to be an introduction on board responsibilities and board member duties. To register, you can email new email address, training@osi.nh.gov, email address shown on your screen, with your name and the municipality you serve or other affiliation. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you all for joining today. Take care and have a great day. Thank you so much.